When I first went to Ecuador, I was stunned at how bad it was. Texaco was the exclusive operator in this area, and then Chevron ended up buying Texaco. And in a few short years, it was all wiped out and poisoned by this system of oil extraction that literally dumped on a daily basis 5 million gallons of toxic oil waste into rivers and streams. The water people drank was contaminated. The air they breathed was contaminated. The food they ate was contaminated.
My friend Steve Donziger is a brave environmental lawyer who took on Chevron on behalf of Amazonian communities in Ecuador, with whom I also work. I talk a lot about corporate capture of our governmental agencies, which are transformed from guardians of the public interest into indentured servants of power and profit. Corporate capture has made inroads into our legal system too. Let me tell you about how we can do something about it.
I have always been motivated by a desire to use whatever advocacy or legal talents I have on behalf of those who are in trouble or who are, being unfairly attacked or mistreated. It's just what I like to do. In Ecuador, everyone relied on these natural water systems, rivers, streams, creeks, for their sustenance, for their water, for their bathing, for their fishing, for their food. Texaco basically gouged these giant waste pits right out of the jungle floor with no lining and dumped all this oil waste, which is liquid and rock and all this toxic brew, into these unlined pits. Texaco built a system that was designed to pollute. Like, they actually put pipes in the sides of these pits to deliberately run them off into rivers and streams that indigenous people living in the area were getting their drinking water from. What I saw was far worse than I ever could have imagined. We filed a lawsuit. What lawyers tend to always think they can solve these problems through the law, and we filed a lawsuit in the US courts. Texaco insisted the case be heard in Ecuador. We battled them for 10 years. Yeah.
Let me just emphasize this. You didn't want to move to the Ecuador courts.
Right.
Chevron wanted to move to the Ecuador courts because they thought that Ecuador would be more pliable and more susceptible to the influence of big oil companies.
They thought they could engineer a dismissal of the case through politics.
And you fought it for 10 years, but then they got their way.
Yeah.
So they moved to Ecuador. So tell what happens next.
So we started, the case down there started in 2001. In 2011, we won a landmark judgment against them. We won the case.
In Ecuador.
In Ecuador, where they wanted the case to be held. And at that point, I'll never forget it, their general counsel says, he basically says, we're going to fight the indigenous peoples until hell freezes over, and then we're going to fight it out on the ice. He said that, Charles James. And they vowed never to pay a penny. And
what was the judgment from the court in Ecuador?
It was initially $19 billion, but on appeal it was cut in half. It ended up being $9.5 billion, plus with fees and awards it was like $10 billion. It's now higher because of interest. Now that might sound like a lot of money, but just by way of comparison, BP has already paid out $70 billion for harm caused by the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And given that this was the most sustained assault in the most beautiful environment for decade after decade, it's now gone on for 50 years, it's actually a modest amount of money when you look at the magnitude of the damage, and you also understand that Chevron has revenues of approximately $250 billion a year. So we got this judgment.
And this, by the way, this area is some of the most pristine rainforests in the world prior to Texaco's invasion. It has some of the highest species diversity on Earth. It has indigenous people, including indigenous people who are uncontacted.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
I've never seen white people before.
I mean, we talked to people, some of the indigenous leaders who would confront the Texaco engineers, like in the 1970s and 80s, and they were installing the system. And they would say, what's up with this oil running in our streams and rivers? And the engineers would mock them and basically say, oil is like vitamins. It's like milk. Just you can drink it. It doesn't harm you. And there was an intense amount of racism. To this day, they're still suffering tremendously. But the bottom line is, the communities, the indigenous groups you were working with, and the farmer communities, the colonists, all united in one class action lawsuit and won this resounding victory affirmed by Ecuador's Supreme Court on appeal in the very country where Chevron insisted that the trial be held. But rather than pay the judgment, Chevron then went after me in this incredible corporate retaliation campaign.
And explain how they went after you.
Okay. So the first thing they did was to try to criminalize me personally. Like, we're going to flip the script and make this guy into the biggest villain. And they paid a fancy law firm literally hundreds of millions of dollars in fees. They had 150 lawyers working on this to target me and some of my colleagues. And they filed this lawsuit and they designed it to read like a criminal indictment. I mean, the way they wrote it up. And the judge, who was very pro-corporate, has financial ties to Chevron, accepted the case. And I ended up in a...
What judge?
Lou Kaplan.
He's a New York federal judge.
He's a New York federal judge. This particular judge failed to disclose he had investments in Chevron. He had a whole history of pro-corporate rulings. He had been on the committee of the tobacco industry when they were litigating, those lawsuits back in the 70s and 80s. And he basically worked with Chevron's lawyers to try to destroy me as a way of avoiding payment to the people Chevron poisoned in Ecuador. They looked at the landscape and said, if we can get that guy and get him off the case, the people down there will be left defenseless. So the first thing they did is they sued me for the most amount of money any person in this country has ever been sued for, $60 billion. And their goal was to intimidate me and to force me to basically quit. Because what lawyer in their right mind, according to their calculations, would hang in there when he or she is facing total financial ruin, okay? But we kept going, and basically we called their bluff because on the eve of trial, they dropped every penny of those damages to avoid a jury. Because if you don't sue for money in a civil case, the defendant doesn't get a jury. So when we were about to go try the case, they suddenly dropped all the damages claims. So at that point, there was what I would describe as a show trial. They brought in witnesses, they paid, and the judge was making a whole series of evidentiary rulings. Like, for example, he barred the use of the word pollution during the trial. I was not allowed to talk about pollution in Ecuador during the entire trial. He said, if you talk about pollution in Ecuador, I'm going to hold you in contempt of court. But the whole case is about pollution in Ecuador. So I learned firsthand how the legal system can be manipulated by a corporation for its own private purposes to destroy a human rights lawyer, that's me, as a way to evade paying some of the most vulnerable communities on the planet that the company poisons. I kept going with my clients in Ecuador to sue Chevron and other countries like Canada, and then we sued them in Brazil to collect on their assets. When we won that decision, they decided to come after me again. Chevron did through this judge, and they went to him and asked him to impose millions of dollars of court costs on me to reimburse them for their legal fees that they had used to attack me. And when I couldn't, as a human rights lawyer, I was never a person of great means. When I could not pay these fines, they asked the judge to order me to turn over my computer to them so they could examine where my money might be. And I was basically broke at this point. And I told the judge, hold me in civil contempt. I'm appealing your order. Would violate attorney-client privilege, put the lives of my clients in Ecuador at great risk, and I just can't do it. And they were trying to get me to violate my ethical duties to the people who I was representing in Ecuador. So the judge held me in civil contempt. I appealed this crazy order. And while that appeal was pending, he held me in criminal contempt of court. He took his charges to the U.S. attorney in New York City to prosecute me. That the U.S. attorney refused to prosecute me, rejected the charges, and then the judge did something that I've never heard of, and frankly, I'm embarrassed about for our whole country. He appointed a private corporate law firm to prosecute me in the name of the U.S. government.
I didn't know you could do that.
I didn't know you could either till it happened. Actually, you can't do that, but he did it anyway because it's illegal. And the crazy part is I learned 6 months later, the judge never disclosed that the law firm, the name of the law firm is Seward and Kissel. It's a small kind of oil and gas law firm. They had Chevron as a client. I was essentially being prosecuted directly by Chevron in the name of the U.S. government. And the first thing they did on a misdemeanor is something that has not happened to one lawyer in our history. They locked me up pre-trial on a misdemeanor contempt that was bogus to begin with. They slapped an ankle bracelet on my leg. I live in Manhattan in a 2-bedroom apartment. I had to go home, and I could not leave my home except for like legal meetings and stuff for 2 years and 2 months, when the maximum sentence was only 6 months had I been convicted. And what worries me as a advocate, as someone who speaks out against injustice, like you do, is this is a playbook that I believe the oil and gas industry in particular, but also other industries like the pharmaceutical industry, will use against those who are a little too successful in holding them accountable for their wrongdoing. By the way, the pollution down there, when you were there in the 80s, it was bad. It's now called by experts the Amazon Chernobyl. It's considered probably the worst pollution in the world right now. And it's been sitting out there in this isolated part of the world for decades. Very few people know about it. And while I'm telling you my story, okay, because this is very personal to me and my family, okay, it's been really hard. I just want to say that the people of Ecuador, many of them have died. I would say thousands have died. We don't know the exact number because Chevron will never fund a study to find out. But there have been so many people I've met over the 30 years I worked on this who have perished because of cancers and other diseases created by exposures to these toxins that they deliberately dumped out of pure greed into the rainforests that are still sitting out there decades after they started. It's embarrassing that our government allows this kind of thing to happen. And not only allows it to happen, I mean, we were litigating for years in Ecuador. The US Embassy, okay, in Quito, was almost completely on the side of Chevron. They looked at the Ecuadorians who were trying to bring the case to clean up their ancestral lands as some sort of problem. So the US government has become so, and I saw this with my own eyes, so pro-corporate with this kind of thing, that it's very difficult for the government to be considered a neutral party anymore. And I know you had this experience with a lot of your work in the environmental field, with the vaccines and the pharmaceutical industry. In my experience, Chevron has so much control right now over this element of the judiciary that they literally are not paying a judgment they owe to 30,000 people who are at imminent risk of death because of the power they have over the US government. And it's just not fair. And they tried to shut me up. They tried to silence me. They thought I would go away. They're still trying to intimidate me. But the reality is I'm not shutting up because people need to know that this happens. And the only thing that's left to do from the Ecuadorian communities is to get a team of lawyers to go enforce the judgment against their assets in other countries. And I'll add that I can't leave this country. I've been a hostage in the United States for 5 years. I have not left the country for 5 years because Chevron had the judge confiscate my passport on the grounds that I hadn't turned my computer and confidential case file over to their lawyers. Even though I'm not detained anymore, and I spent 993 days detained, I'm not really free. I don't have the same rights as a typical American citizen. I don't have a passport. They took my law license without a hearing. They literally went into my bank accounts and wiped them out without even telling me. Suddenly you end up with all the resources you thought you could always count on for your future, for the future of your son, your family. They just went away. I mean, they went away overnight. And the reality is they could lock me up any day they want. All they have to do is go back to the judge and say he still hasn't turned over his computer. Why don't you charge him with a new criminal contempt? So I live, with this sort of situation that's almost unfathomable for a country like the United States of America.
You mentioned the U.S. Embassy being on the side of U.S. corporations rather than the side of democracy or justice or public health or the high ideals of our country. And it reminded me of Allen Dulles, who was essentially the first head of the CIA. When Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1954 tried to nationalize the properties of BP, British Petroleum in Texaco, to make sure that their country could be paid for the oil that was under, that God had put our oil under their ground somehow. Dulles overthrew Mossadegh, the first democratically elected president in the 4,000-year-old
Yeah.
history of Iran. And, you know, Texaco famously, for the first decades of its existence, flew a pirate flag, a skull and crossbones, a Jolly Roger, on its world headquarters instead of the American flag.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, you talk to people in the industry, and like they talk about Texaco, like it's really. I mean, they're all have
all
major
bad, but
problems.
Texaco
was just they actually like enjoyed being bad. And the crazy part is it's still going on. My little role in life for the last 30 years, my humble role with others has been to try to hold one company accountable for this awful disaster. And by the way, polluters need to pay for their pollution if we're going to deal with the climate issue, in my opinion. And we have been unable, because of the bias of the court system and because of the power of this company, to basically force them to comply with the rule of law and pay the people to whom they owe money for poisoning their lands. And what does that say about us as a country? What does it say that our government, our embassy in this country, takes the side of the polluter rather than those who are victims of the pollution? It's a really sad commentary. And you know, people talk about the loss of U.S. power in the world, the loss of our influence. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but one is, and I would argue, our government consistently takes the side of corporations that harm people in other countries when it shouldn't.
I mean, ultimately, what happened in Ecuador is just a symptom of the corporate capture of all of the institutions of our democracy, the subversion of American democracy, not only the regulatory agencies, not only the Department of Energy, which is just a sock puppet for the oil industry and the utilities, et cetera, but also the judiciary. And I think that's what would surprise most Americans, because they think that's the judiciary.
I think that's the bulwark against what we're talking about. Yeah. But I would argue it's actually become co-opted by the same phenomenon at this point. I mean, the judiciary. People used to think, oh, look, at least we can rely on our courts. Based on my experience and some of the stuff you've experienced, I'm not so sure that's the case. And like the other thing is this silencing. I mean, I read your book and you talked about how, I don't know, a few years ago you were making like 200, 250 speeches a year and it's just dried up. Like it's like someone made a decision, we're not going to let this guy have a voice anymore, And like credit to you for building this campaign, because you have a voice. And I tried to do the same thing. You just build these separate institutions and ways to sort of get your voice out there. But like the major media ignored me. I mean, I was sitting in my apartment for almost 3 years with an ankle bracelet, human rights lawyer locked up in America. I live in Manhattan. It's a 20-minute walk from the New York Times newsroom. Do you think any reporter from the New York Times covered me? They were doing stories on lawyers locked up in Turkey and Myanmar, Saudi Arabia. And I'm sitting right here and I'm like, you guys need to cover this. And they couldn't cover it. So
they get full page Texaco ads.
I know. Chevron's like one of their biggest advertisers.
What are you looking at the future?
I feel optimistic. I am going to, keep fighting with my clients in Ecuador for a recovery. I'm taking on other human rights work, and I refuse to be silenced. The reality is the case against Chevron needs to be fought and finished. And we're hopefully going to get a team of lawyers and enough financing to be able to do that, so that people can get a cleanup. I mean, obviously, this has affected me greatly, but like Chevron tries to make it all about me. So I just want to remind people that when you hear my story, I am being attacked because we were successful. That's why they're attacking me. They don't want this model of lawyers from the United States working with indigenous leaders in the Amazon, financed by, donors who really care about the environment. They don't want that model. That model was too successful and it resulted in a $10 billion liability against Chevron. So they are trying to destroy not only me, but the model. I tell my clients, I'm like, they not only want to win the case, they want to kill off the idea that you can do this kind of case. And like what I'm really fighting for, and what I think my colleagues are fighting for in this case, is for the viability of the rule of law, the viability of people to exercise their legal rights, to take wrongdoers to court, to make them pay for the harm they caused. And that's why they're going after us so hard. I mean, it makes no rational sense. They could have settled this case. They have spent, we estimate, $3 billion. They've used 2,000 lawyers and 60 law firms to fight us. I mean, it's extraordinary. One way that people can help is to support my campaign for a pardon from President Biden. You know, people in the United States should not be prosecuted privately by a corporation. I don't care what you think of my work, what people think of me as a person. I happen to think I'm a good person, but you can even have a bad opinion of me and be offended by the idea that a corporation can lock someone up in this country. So we're asking President Biden to pardon me, and we have the support of dozens of Nobel laureates and, you know, members of Congress and others. And we don't think this is a right-left issue. This is a rule of law issue. And actually, a lot of, you know, very conservative lawyers have approached me to support this pardon campaign because people are justifiably very offended by the idea that someone who has worked in human rights his whole life could end up in jail on a bogus contempt case prosecuted by the corporate adversary against which he won a landmark judgment. I mean, it's just unheard of. So we're pushing this, and, you know, we really want people to support it. And people can go, I have a website, by the way, it's freedonziger.com, and people can go there and sign our petition and support our campaign. Again, it's freedonziger.com.
Steve Donziger, thank you so much for your courage, for your perseverance, and for your commitment to the highest values of our country and of humanity.
I really, really appreciate it. Back at you for the courage you've displayed your whole life in fighting for justice. It's really been an inspiration.